Greetings, students. Today we are continuing in our study of the philosophy of the Buddha Dharma. And we're going to think about Paticca Samuppada, right? Consider this quote. He who sees Paticca Samuppada sees the Dharma, and he who sees the Dharma sees Paticca Samuppada. The Buddha here has made a strong claim. He's saying, if Paticca Samuppada, then the Dharma, and if the Dharma, then Paticca Samuppada. If you're a student of logic, you know that that means that these two things are logically equivalent. Let's see if we can understand what the Buddha means by this claim. Now, in your book by Wapola Rahula, he translated this term as conditioned genesis or dependent co-arising, but the term I'll favor is the one Thich Nhat Hanh uses called interbeing. But they're all referring back to this particular word. And I'd like to start us out with a reading from Francis Harold Cook in a book about Dogen Zenji. He's talking about this idea of Paticca Samuppada, and it can give us a sort of context and a flavor to the idea to help us work our way into it. There is no absolute reality beyond or distinct from this world of interdependent being. It is a place where the individual arises out of an extremely extensive environment of other living individuals. Parents, grandparents, culture, soil, water, stone, mist, and many, many more, and takes its place as one other individual. Once in the world, the individual is constantly and massively conditioned by the extensive environment of other individuals. Its life or career is touched by the others in a forceful or negligible way, but it is nevertheless touched, and in being touched, it is changed and activated. The many other conditionings of its being thus makes its being possible, sustain it and transform it, and ultimately bring about its non-being. It is nothing apart from its larger world, for it is not just determined by the world, but is also constituted out of the world. However, this is only one side of the picture. The other side is the way in which this individual itself exerts a conditioning influence on the world. What we see is a kind of circularity of conditioning power, whereby the world conditions the individual who acts, and this action in turn circulates back into the world to change and motivate it. The motion, however, is simultaneous, and the world is an extremely active place of unimaginable change. Thank you, Professor Cook, for your wonderful book. Now, the earliest statement we have of this teaching is found in this saying attributed to the Buddha: when there is this, that is. With the arising of this, that arises. When this is not, neither is that. With the cessation of this, that ceases. This idea that everything's interdependent and depend on each other. This could also remind you of Taoist philosophy, right? Say beauty and ugliness is born. Say warm and hot. Say hot, then there's warm, right? With the arising of this, that arises. When this is not, neither is that. And you can see how, again, like I've said before, when Buddhism came to China, they met up with the Taoists, and Zen Buddhism resulted. There's a great affinity between these two philosophies. Now, there are certain corollaries to this idea of interbeing, or Paticca Samuppada, certain things that follow from it, right? First and centrally, there's the idea that nothing exists by itself, that everything is understood in relation to something else and cannot be understood without it. Right? Nothing exists by itself. Right? And second, all things are then mutually caused. There's no one thing that's responsible for everything else. There's no God, there's no creator. Instead, there's this dynamic field where everything is interacting with everything else. And creation, as Francis Harold Cook put it, is continual and continuous, a dynamic process of mutually caused change. This also means that what we think of as a thing is an abstraction. Now, a thing would be something that stays self-identical across time, where you could find some sort of essence in it. This is a very old idea. We could trace it back in the West to Aristotle, who thought that what was most real were things, and things had an essence a sort of ultimate reality that you could grasp with your mind and express in words. But in Buddha Dharma, there is no absolute space and time, and there are no things, right? Space would be a thing, right? Time would be a thing, but instead, space is absolutely relational, and since things are always changing, time as some sort of measure of the change just doesn't work. And then this means no lasting names, because there's no essence to tag that name to. Names are merely provisional. They're merely fingers pointing at the moon, an idea familiar to us by now from our study in these other philosophies. No lasting names, because there would have to be a permanent thing to stick that name on. Instead, a name is a provisional pointer, just a way of helping us navigate our way through this dynamic process we find ourselves in the midst of, and that we are inextricably linked to. Now, one of my favorite statements of this idea of Paticca Samuppada is by the great Zen teacher Thich Nhat Hanh, who coined this word interbeing. And if you'll take out your book, right, you should have your books with you, or pause the tape, or pause the video and go get your book, right, and flipping it with me to page 3. It's the chapter called Interbeing, which is right after the text on the heart of perfect understanding. So really it's the first thing in the book. And read along with me. If you're a poet, you will clearly see that there is a cloud floating in this sheet of paper. Without a cloud, there will be no rain. Without rain, the tree cannot grow. And without trees, we cannot make paper. The cloud is essential for the paper to exist. If the cloud is not here, the sheet of paper cannot be here either. So we can say that the cloud and the paper are. Interbeing is a word that's not in the dictionary yet, but if we combine the prefix inter with the verb to be, we have a new verb, interbe. If we look into the sheet of paper even more deeply, we can see the sunshine in it. If the sunshine is not there, the forest cannot grow. In fact, nothing can grow. Even we cannot grow without sunshine. And so we know that the sunshine is also in this sheet of paper. The paper and the sunshine are. And if we continue to look, we can see the logger who cut the tree and brought it to the mill to be transformed into paper. And we see the wheat. We know that the logger cannot exist without his daily bread, and therefore the wheat that became his bread is also in this sheet of paper. And the logger's father and mother are in it too. When we look in this way, we see that without all of these things, this sheet of paper cannot exist. Looking even more deeply, we can see we are in it too. This is not difficult to see, because when we look at a sheet of paper, the sheet of paper is part of our perception. Your mind is in here, and mine is also. So we can say that everything is in here in this sheet of paper. You cannot point out one thing that is not here. Time, space, the earth, the rain, the minerals in the soil, the sunshine, the cloud, the rivers, the heat. Everything coexists with this sheet of paper. That is why I think the word inter should be in the dictionary. To be is to interbe. You cannot just be by yourself alone. You have to interbe with every other thing. This sheet of paper is because everything else is. Suppose we try to return one of the elements to its source. Suppose we return the sunshine to the sun. Do you think that this sheet of paper would be possible? No, without sunshine nothing can be. And if we return the logger to his mother, then we have no sheet of paper either. The fact is that this sheet of paper is made up only of non-paper elements. And if we return these non-paper elements to their sources, there can be no paper at all. Without non-paper elements like mind, logger, sunshine, and so on, there will be no paper. As thin as this sheet of paper is, it contains everything in the universe in it. Well, thank you, Master Teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh. I think this is my favorite book on the planet Earth. If anybody asked me what my favorite book was, this would be it. It's an amazing text. Now, what immediately follows from the idea of impermanence is the idea of what is called no self. Right? Think about it, right? They're the three seals. Sometimes there's four, but I love the way Buddhists do that. 3 or maybe 4, depends on what'll help you the most make sense of it, right? But remember, the first one is the truth of impermanence, the first seal, and the second seal is no self. Because if everything is changing and nothing remains the same, then there's no fixed identity or permanent independent self in anything. Nothing remains self-identical across time. And the best thing to apply this to, of course, is ourselves, to think about ourselves. And what that means is that we are not independent of causes and conditions, right? Think about that. You come into being because of this many causes and conditions in our environment, right? You had to have grandparents and parents and great-grandparents, and you've got to have an atmosphere, and the earth has to be in the Goldilocks zone around the sun, and your parents had to meet at a particular time and place, and they had to be healthy enough to have children, and children had to be born, and on and on and on, right? All these different causes and conditions feeding in for your existence to be possible, right? And in the midst of this, you're a part of a process too, and you are not unchanging. I like to think of it, we're like a whirlpool in a river, right? And the causes and conditions are like the water flow, the banks on the river, the sunshine, the wind, the depths of the water, and under certain causes and conditions, a whirlpool comes into being. And those, as long as those conditions last, I can remember going down to rivers and there'd be a whirlpool and it'd just be there. It seemed like for days. And you'd come to expect to see it there. And you'd almost think of it like the whirlpool, like it's some fixed, unchanging thing. But that whirlpool is not independent of causes and conditions. And when those causes and conditions changed, one day I went and part of the bank had fallen in and the water level had risen and the whirlpool was no longer there. Right? That's the idea. Not that you're nothing, which would make no sense, because here I am sitting here with my beard in my room with my Star Wars action figures over there. You can't see them right now. But they're over there. There's Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon and Yoda. But in any case, I definitely am here, but not as a permanent self. I'm like that whirlpool in a river. Another image I like is those ocean streams, a stream in the ocean. It sort of starts, bounces along through the waves, and then it ends, right? No permanent self. So you can see that when the one who woke up said there is no self as one of the basic features of existence, he did not mean I do not exist, as if this particular event known as Jim Getch was imaginary or unreal, but that there is no I that exists as a substance, a thing independent of process, interdependence, and change. This means that the egocentric experience of events, where we make ourselves to be the center of things, is a distortion of clear experience, leading us to the experience of dukkha as the event that will always co-arise with it. But there is no unchanging I, no unchanging subject of experience, no enduring independent self. There is a self, but not an independent self. Consider how the Buddha put it one day to a fellow named Bahiya who came asking him about these things. Then, Bahiya, you should train yourself in this way. In the seen, there's only the seen. In the heard, there's only the heard. In the sensed, there is only the sensed. In the known, there is only the known. Thus you should see that indeed there is no thing here. This, Bahiya, is how you should train yourself. Since, Bahiya, there is for you in the seen only the seen, in the heard only the heard, in the sensed only the sensed, in the known only the known, there is no you, Bahiya, in connection with that. And when there is no you, Bahiya, in connection with that, there is no you there. When there is no you there, you, Bahiya, are neither here nor there nor between the two. This, just this, is the end of dukkha. When you see something, there's just the seeing. When you hear something, there is just the hearing of it. When you think of something, there's just thinking, and there's no need to put the I in it. Take a strong emotion, for example, like anger. Don't say, I am angry, but instead realize there is anger. Recognize it, and there is no you there. One image they often use is, you're the sky, and your emotions are the clouds arising within it. And the sky is not the clouds, right? What does it mean to say there's no you there? It's talking about the realm of the object. It implies that we recognize that the scene is merely the scene, and that's it. There are forms, shapes, colors, and so forth, but there is no thing as an independent substance apart from process, change, and interdependence there. There is no real substance, no solidity, and no self-existent reality. All there is the quality of the experience itself, no more, no less. There is just seeing, hearing, feeling, sensing, knowing. And the mind naming it all is also just another experience, just the thinking. The space of the classroom at Eckerd, Professor Getch's voice. Here is the thought, do I understand this? Now another thought. What on earth is he talking about? There is what is seen, heard, tasted, and so on, but there's no thingness, no solid independent entity that this experience refers to. And not only do we realize that there is no thing out there, but we also realize that there's no solid thing in here. No independent and fixed entity that is the experiencer. As the Buddha said to Bahiya, you will not be able to find yourself either in the world of the subject or in the world of that object or anywhere else between the two. There is only this lovely dynamic process that we are sparkling in the midst of. One way the Buddha taught to think about this was what he called the teaching of the 5 skandhas, or Rahula called them aggregates. And the basic idea is that what we call ourself is a dynamic process of constant change, and yet there are patterns to the change that can orient us in understanding what it means to be human. Think of the 5 skandhas, or aggregates, or elements, as 5 ways of looking at the dynamic process that is what we are. Thich Nhat Hanh likes to call them the 5 rivers of ourself, like 5 rivers feeding in to us, to give a sense that they're not static but dynamic. And they consist of form, or the physical body, feelings or sensation, perception, mental formation, and consciousness. I'll give you a brief overview of these to orient us so you understand what I'm talking about. Now, according to Buddha Dharma philosophy, one of the main sources of dukkha is the delusion that we're a permanent, unchanging center of reality, that our self is a permanent entity that is a permanent center of experience. And so the Buddha Dharma asks us to be mindful of our personal experience, in essence to do a phenomenological analysis of our experience of the self. And the teaching of the 5 skandhas is one way to do that, to become mindful about what it means to experience being human. In Buddha Dharma, the external world is never considered separate from the observer. Just as in phenomenology, we examine what the philosopher Edmund Husserl called the life world, the world of lived human experience. And in that experience, all experience of so-called outer realities are directly tied to experiencing the so-called inner realities. And if we do this, we see that all our experience of material outer realities, all material phenomena, are defined by the fact that they can be seen, heard, smelled, tasted, or touched. If material phenomena were not perceived via our senses, we would never know anything of them. We can then add to our 5 senses the various mental and psychological factors that mediate all this, and these states of mind further condition how we experience our environment, so that mind and body, inner and outer, can never really be separated. The teaching of the 5 skandhas is then meant to offer an account of how we experience life, not in some theory, but in giving a phenomenological account that can orient us in a way to help us live to be more free, to achieve non-attachment and freedom. Though we tend to think of ourselves as a single solid self, phenomenological analysis can show us that our thoughts and feelings are always changing, always in flux. First I'm happy, then I'm sad, then I'm bored, then I become angry as some irritating thing happens. Then I forget about that when something else comes along, and I begin to concentrate on some plan or the other, only to come back to awareness and realize I've drifted off into thinking something entirely different. And then I injure myself or begin to hurt, and I will feel for a moment that my whole world and self is defined by that pain. And if we pay attention, we can see what we call I is constantly changing. And there is no common thread to it all, as even my body constantly changes, though usually at a slower pace, except when I'm puking. When I'm puking, change is happening far too quickly to my liking. Instead of a fixed self, there's a continuous flow of moments of consciousness, which is called the mind stream. Now, the skandha of form is basically awareness of the physical body. It relates to our 5 senses of sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch, and how we experience the material world through them. Form, or our experience of the physical body, is one of the skandhas that make up what we call a self. And a key point here is that the body is always changing, and this changing nature makes it dukkha, unsatisfactory. Notice how you're always moving around, shifting your position, from chair to couch to floor to bed, crossing your leg, uncrossing it, scratching your head, taking your glasses off, putting them back on, never satisfied, always moving around. I'm hungry, or I have an ache, or I feel good now, but later I might be puking. Then I have to brush my teeth and then go to the bathroom. It just never stops. So one way of meditating is to practice awareness of the first skandha of form, or the body. And when you do, you come to see that the body is not yourself. It's not a solid center of existence, but is a dynamic process of change, a whirlpool just whirling away in the river of life. And that's kind of scary, so we play a trick on ourselves. We learn to call this body mine, and it helps us feel safe. This is me, I say. And yet watch, and me is always changing, and is not always safe. Suddenly I might get ill, and bleed or faint, and it doesn't seem so safe after all. And which one is me, right? If you pay attention, you're more like a stream than anything else, always in movement. Sometimes fatter, sometimes thinner, shorter than taller as I grow older, lots of hair, then alas, no hair. Feeling great and feeling sick and then great again, and it never stops. Which one of these instants in the dynamic process of change is really me? Well, I just am this river of change, not as a thing, but as a process. The second skandha is sensation or feeling, and they're always changing too. And they're traditionally organized into 3 types: pleasant, unpleasant, and indifferent. When we experience an object, or we go into a situation, it takes on one of these tones that color how we feel. We'll always feel pleased, displeased, or indifferent. And these feelings are so basic that we often ignore them, yet they're there, sort of coloring everything we do, forming the background to all our thoughts and actions. We will have these sort of automatic likes or dislikes for the various people or situations we encounter that are triggered, because we're not aware of them. We're not paying attention to them. And this is where we begin to experience attachment and aversion. Instinctively, we seem to want to cling to what is pleasant and avoid the unpleasant. And it's another source of the illusion of a permanent self. We tend to think we own these feelings, that they are mine. I am happy, we say, or I am happy, or I don't care. But have you ever noticed that you really have no control over these things? You can watch them arise, stay for a while, and pass away like clouds in the sky. They too are part of a dynamic process. If you pay attention, you begin to see that feelings are impermanent, that they do not define you, that they are without substance. They are dukkha. We learn not to identify ourselves with them. We learn not to consider our feelings as self, and we do not make feelings our refuge. Feelings are dukkha. The third skandha is perception, or discriminating awareness. This skandha is that part of the experience we have when we classify things. It refers to the process of classification. It is when we begin to assign names to our experience. That can name no lasting name, but we begin to forget that. And we begin to file and sort and organize our world, saying good, bad, friend, enemy, self, other, and so on and on and on, and a list of names that can name no lasting name. The problem with perceptions is that we tend to reify, to take a frozen slice of the process as the reality of it. Thich Nhat Hanh, in a book of his called The Heart of the Buddha's Teachings, says this about it, the skandha. In us there is a river of perceptions. Perceptions arise, stay for a period of time, and cease to be. The aggregate of perception includes noticing, naming, and conceptualizing, as well as the perceiver and the perceived. When we perceive, we often distort, which brings about many painful feelings. Our perceptions are often erroneous, and we suffer. A man was rowing his boat upstream when suddenly he saw another boat coming toward him. He shouted, "Be careful, be careful!" But the boat plowed right into him, nearly sinking his boat. The man became angry and began to shout, but when he looked closely, he saw there was no one in the other boat. The boat had drifted downstream by itself. He laughed out loud. When our perceptions are correct, we feel better. But when our perceptions are not correct, they can cause a lot of unpleasant feelings. We have to look deeply into things so we'll not be led into suffering and difficult feelings. Perceptions are very important to our well-being. Okay? We perceive phenomena on the basis of our lack of insight into the nature of impermanence and inner being. Practicing mindfulness, concentration, and deep looking, we can discover the errors of our perception and free ourselves from fear and clinging, attachment and aversion. All suffering is born from wrong perceptions. Understanding the fruit of meditation can dissolve our wrong perceptions and liberate us. Thank you, Master Thich Nhat Hanh, for those wonderful words. The fourth skandha is called mental formations, and it refers to that part of our experience where we find ourselves conditioned or predisposed to react in certain ways, to respond, behave, or think in a certain characteristic way. This is where what we call our character arises, our particular way of responding to the world around us. With this skandha, ego sort of begins to form into personality, and this leads to action. This is also related to the idea of karma, because when we act in certain ways, we build up certain patterns of action or habits that can either help us or hinder us. It creates what are called karmic triggers, patterns of habitual reaction that carry you away. The mind's always chattering away when you try to meditate, thinking of this, running on about that, your very own little tribe of monkey minds, each vividly their own self and always heading off into another direction, full of fantasies, reacting, pulling you this way and that. Sound familiar? Dukkha. Now the fifth aggregate is consciousness. This is the element of awareness that's essential to generating experience. It produces experience by unifying external objects with cognition. It is sometimes characterized as a kind of storehouse of previous perceptions, emotions, conceptions, and habits that give a certain shape and direction to the stream within the ocean, that is you or I. Here's an example of all these five in action. Walking along, we suddenly see a snake. We first notice the form of the snake registering on our eye sense and eye consciousness. A feeling will then develop, which for most of us will be unpleasant, unless we were the late, great Steve Irwin. We then begin to classify the object, having a perception of it. It's a snake, it's scary, it's poisonous, or it's a beauty. We then react to it in a certain characteristic way, mental formation or habit. Do we avoid it, kill it, pick it up, admire it, and let it go its way in peace? And throughout this process, consciousness is active as part of this complicated dynamic process, creating and recalling perceptions, cognitions, and concepts to guide the process. Right? The five skandhas, then, too, are dukkha. Why? Consider these passages from Thich Nhat Hanh again. Right? The five aggregates enter are When you have a painful feeling, look into your body, your perceptions, your mental formations, and your consciousness to see what has brought about this feeling. If you have a headache, your painful feeling comes from the first aggregate. Painful feeling can also come from mental formations or from perceptions. You might, for example, think someone hates you who actually loves you. Look deeply into the 5 rivers of yourself and see how each river contains the other 4. Look at the river of form. In the beginning, you may think that form is just physical and not mental. But every cell in your body contains all aspect of yourself. The one contains the all. Each aggregate contains all the other aggregates. Each feeling contains all perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. Look into one feeling, you can discover everything. Look in the light of inner being, and you will see the all in the one and the one in the all. Don't think that form exists outside of feeling, or that feeling exists outside of form. You have to think in terms of inner. Thich Nhat Hanh continues to say, in the Turning of the Wheel Sutra, the Buddha said, the 5 skandhas, when grasped at, are suffering. He did not say that the 5 aggregates are in themselves suffering. Right? He said grasping at them is. There's a helpful image in a sutra. A man throws a clod of earth at a dog. The dog looks at the clod of earth and barks at it furiously. The dog does not realize that it is the man and not the clod of earth that's responsible. The sutra goes on to say, in the same way, an ordinary person caught in dualistic conceptions thinks that the 5 aggregates are the cause of his suffering. But in fact, the root of his suffering is his lack of understanding about the impermanent, non-self, and independent nature of the 5 aggregates. It's not the 5 aggregates that make us suffer, but the way we relate to them. When we observe the impermanent, non-self, and interdependent nature of all that is, we will not feel aversion for life. In fact, this knowing will help us see the preciousness of all life. Thank you again, Master Thich Nhat Hanh, for your wonderful writings. So, the 5 skandhas are not 5 separate things. I mean, that would not make any sense, right? Because we're thinking in terms of inner being and there's no separate self. So they're not like 5 little separate atomic elements that combine to make you who you are, because nothing is separate in this way. They're just 5 ways of being mindful of what it means to be human. The 5 skandhas are empty, says Avalokita in this little book I've had you read. Empty of a separate self. Whenever you see emptiness, it means empty of a separate existence. Think of the 5 skandhas as 5 whirlpools in a river. As long as we're alive, the whirlpools will whirl. As long as there is a body to receive sense impressions, there will be feeling, perception, and thought elaborating all this, and certain actions and reactions we build up, right? And these elaborations in turn give rise to a whirling of further thoughts and actions. And so we recreate ourselves from moment to moment, whirling around in the river. But remember the only point of all this. Remember Malankyaputa, the frustrated metaphysician. I mean, it's kind of fun thinking about all these metaphysical points and theories, but that's not why the Buddha taught it. The teaching of no self is meant to help you along the path, that middle path, to achieve nirvana. The point is not to speculate about the self, but just to forget it. So the great Dogen Zenji, the 13th century Zen master, said to study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be enlightened by the 10,000 things. Oh, I got to jump up on the board and correct what I wrote up there. Hold on a second. The 10,000 things. The teaching, no, that should be the teaching. The teaching of no self is not a metaphysical position, but a way of practice, a way of looking at the world to free you from attachment and aversion, from that tanha, that obsessive desire that's the cause of our dukkha. In fact, remember the raft. A particular viewpoint in the Buddha Dharma functions as part of the way to freedom from attachment, and it's not a goal at the end to hold on to, like that raft where you walk around with it on your head. This is from a sutra This the realized one discerns, and he discerns that these standpoints, thus seized, thus held to, lead to such and such a destination, to such and such a state, right? Like the raft. And he discerns what surpasses this. He gets to the other bank. That's what the frickin' raft was for. And yet he does not hold to that act of discerning. This thought helps you get somewhere. Then you don't hold on to the thought, right? Because your whole point was to get to that other shore. And as he is not holding to it, unbinding is experienced right within. That's the whole point, being free. And through lack of clinging, he is released. So Upasiva asked, one who has reached the end, does he not exist? Or is he for eternity free from affliction? He must be Malankaputa's brother. Please, sage, declare this to me as this phenomena has been known by you. The Buddha said, one who has reached the end has no criterion by which anyone would say that. It does not exist for him, right? Whoop, there we go. I left a word out on the board there. Let me add that. When all phenomena are put aside, all means of speaking are put aside as well, right? Tao called Tao is not Tao. So there's another story that emphasizes this point. I told you the Buddha Dharma was full of stories. So Vacchagotta comes to the Buddha and asks, Venerable Gautama, is there an Atman, an eternal self? The Buddha is silent. Then Venerable Gautama, is there no Atman? Again the Buddha is silent. Vacchagotta gets up and goes away. And after the Paravrajaka, the wanderer, that just means the wanderer, after the wanderer had left, Ananda asked the Buddha why he did not answer Vacchagotta's question. Ananda, if I were to answer that there is a self, that would be conforming with those priests and contemplatives who are exponents of eternalism, the view that there is an eternal soul. And if I were to answer that there is no self, that would be conforming with those priests and contemplatives who are exponents of annihilationism, that death is the annihilation of experience. If I were to answer that there is a self, would that be in keeping with the arising of the knowledge that all phenomena are not self? No, Lord. And if I were to answer that there is no self, the bewildered Vacchagotta would become even more bewildered. Does the self that I used to have now not exist? The Buddha was just thinking how he could help out Vacchagotta. The whole idea is to become free. And when you're void of self, of the idea of an independent self, right? You're not going to be an annihilationist and say there's nothing. And you're not going to be an eternalist and say there's like this everlasting Atman entity that goes on forever, or some God that lives forever that exists in eternity. Instead, you take the middle path right between the two. And you say there's a self, but it's a changing self. It's a dynamic process. So, void of a permanent self, empty of an unchanging self, there's only this that you're part of. Look around, wherever you are. Ehi Paticca, come and see how quite astonishing this all is. This amazing process, which shines ever more brightly, ever more clearly, ever more vividly, when the obscuring lens of self is cast off, free of attachment, and we enter the stream of impermanence. I have heard that the Buddha put it like this, when he first realized this. Thus have I heard. I wandered through the rounds of countless births, seeking but not finding the house builder. Painful is birth ever and again. O house builder, you have now been seen. You should not build the house again. Oh, look, I wrote that wrong on the board. All things are impermanent. Let's start again. I wandered through the rounds of countless births, seeking but not finding the house builder. And who's the house builder? Well, it's our old friend Tana, obsession, desire, obsessive desire, that builds the house of the false idea of a permanent self independent of the world that's the cause of all our dukkha. I wandered through the rounds of countless births, seeking but not finding the house builder. Painful as birth ever and again. O house builder, you have now been seen. You shall not build the house again. All your rafters have been broken. Your ridgepole is shattered too. My mind has now attained unconditional freedom and reached the end of every sort of craving. Consider Francis Harold Cook's wonderful words again as he explains this idea. When the ridgepole is shattered and the house is not built again, what you realize? It is a place where the individual arises out of an extremely extensive environment of other living individuals. Parents, grandparents, culture, soil, water, stone, mist, and many, many more, and takes its place as one other individual. Once in the world, the individual is constantly and massively conditioned by the extensive environment of other individuals. Its life or career is touched by the others in a forceful or negligible way, but it is nevertheless touched, and in being touched it is changed and activated. The many other conditionings of its being thus makes its being possible, sustain it and transform it, and ultimately bring about its non-being. It is nothing apart from its larger world, for it is not just determined by the world, but it also is constituted out of the world. However, this is only one side of the picture. The other side is the way in which this individual itself exerts a conditioning influence on the world. What we see is a kind of circularity of conditioning power, whereby the world conditions the individual, who acts, and this action in turn circulates, right? There are individuals, but they're just not independent individuals. They are interdependent parts of the process, who acts, and in this action in turn circulates back into the world and change it and motivate it. The motion, however, is simultaneous, and the world is an extremely active place of unimaginable change. Isn't it? This interdependence, this interbeing, is also emptiness, individually and collectively. The world is absolute nothingness, or the emptiness of interdependence, eternally and incessantly crystallizes in the form of a bird, person, flower, stone, and cloud, and Eckhart student. Consequently, to be a Buddhist means to learn to understand the pedigree of the individual as well as its true nature. Because of this pedigree and nature, the bird is not just a bird in some flatly materialistic and realistic sense. It is that, but at the same time it is emptiness, absolute nothingness, and a crystallized expression of interdependent being. It is simultaneously relative and absolute, and it is this identity that is symbolized by terms that Dogen Zenji uses, such as calling the world one bright pearl. If we do not understand this, then Dogen may be misunderstood as a mere nature worshipper, pure and simple, or an aesthetic naturalist. However, the individual is to be grasped as embedded in the matrix or backdrop, and as being a focalization of the backdrop itself. It remains a real bird with feathers and beak and chirpings and poop, yet it bears about it a dimension of profundity and mystery to be discovered. That which you see before you as absolute reality means that what we experience is absolute reality because it's a focalization or crystallization of emptiness, absolute nothingness, which means simply interdependent being. This being the case, we cannot realistically say that one thing is more real or more absolute than another thing. This refusal to carve up the world into the real and the unreal, and the refusal to exclude anything from the category of the ultimately real, has wide ramifications. The metaphysics feeds into the ethics, and the ethics feeds into the metaphysics, because metaphysics and ethics inter-are. Dogen seems to have rejected the idea that enlightenment was an escape or transcendence of worldly condition. His way has been characterized as the way of realization, the way of thoroughly comprehending the true nature of some situation, such as impermanence or death, in such a way that it's not transcended, evaded, or denied, what Pema Chodron calls the wisdom of no escape. The condition does not vanish, and the freedom to be had in the midst of conditions comes from the unequivocal affirmation and acceptance of the condition through comprehension. As Dogen Zenji said, this very body is the body of enlightenment. This very life and death is the Buddha. So he rejects the possibility that enlightenment is a way of evading conditions, as if the realization of Buddha nature provided you with a haven of permanence and security. Consequently, the enlightened ability to see all aspects and situations of life as one bright pearl is no mere aesthetic appreciation of nature, nor is it a primitive spiritualism or pantheism. To understand it thoroughly is to live creatively and with gratitude as a free being. Zen speaks of this as the ability to float and swim effortlessly and comfortably in the stream of impermanence. So there's the need to practice meditation to realize this. Right? Why practice, you ask, if I'm already the Buddha nature? Well, Dogen told this story in response to someone who wrote him a letter, asking him that very question. A letter he wrote in 1223 ACE. Isn't that amazing? In 13th century Japan, somebody wrote a letter to Dogen Zenji. And here's my man, Dogen Zenji, thinking about one bright pearl. And they wrote Dogen Zenji a letter and asked, why practice if I already am the Buddha nature? And he told this story. In the letter, he wrote back to him, Prince Pacha of Mount Maku was fanning himself. A monk came by and asked, the wind's nature is eternal and omnipresent. Why, reverend sir, are you still fanning yourself? The master replied, you only know that the wind's nature is eternal, but you do not know the reason why it exists everywhere. The monk asked, after that story in this letter he wrote, Dogen Zenji adds, the authenticating experience of the Buddha Dharma and the vital way of correct transmission are like this. Those that say because the nature of wind is eternal, there is no need for a fan, and we can experience the wind without one, understand neither the meaning of its eternity nor its nature. Because the wind is eternal, the wind of Buddhism manifests the yellow gold of the earth and turns its long rivers into sweet cream. So thank you for your kind attention. I look forward to seeing what questions and comments you have when we gather together next week in our Zoom session. Thank you.